is obvious. I was
No, there is scope for everything.
but
To be in balance.
if you don't apply what you learn, it's never going to be.
Okay, good evening everybody, and welcome to this session, Adaptive Learning, as part of the ADIBF Academy's Future-Proof Teacher. And welcome, and let me welcome Dr. Ulrik and Christensen. Thank you. Dr. Ulrik is working with Ulrik, and he's developed a number of world-leading products for adaptive education. And he's a world leader in the field of education technology. And I'm just so happy.
Thank you very much. So, thank you for the opportunity to get out of the US, where I've spent most of my time over the last years. And finally actually have a chance for hopefully having a very different conversation about this than normally, where I've been basically giving a substantial part of this talk 300 or 400 times. I'm going to do it a little bit differently today. So I can see a couple of familiar faces, so it will be different, so don't leave yet. The first thing I would like actually to know is I have a very little sense for who you guys are. How many of you are from the industry? In industry meaning, how many of you make learning products or books? How many of you are teachers? All right. That's good, because that was what I was hoping for. This is where I came from. This is the tallest building in Denmark. So if we look around here, it's not very tall. It's 26 storages tall. It's a hospital. And it's a university hospital in Copenhagen. The top floor here is a simulation center that is the outcome of research we did in the early 90s. I was still in medical school, and we were looking at why doctors and nurses make error under pressure. And we built simulation environments as research environments. I've never really wanted to be an edtech startup. I was interested in trying to fix a much more valuable problem, I thought, which was 8,000 Danes die every year preventably from human errors, 100,000 Americans. So it's a really big thing. It's something where if you can understand that better, why do people not perform under pressure? It's really something that matters. It's 20 times September 11th every year. If it happened on one day, we would shut down the health system. So that was a fascinating problem, and we thought it was all about human factors. It was about teamwork, softer things. I want you to bear that in mind when we think about blended environments. I want you to keep thinking throughout the next 45 minutes. Every time I talk about something, how does that actually relate to this problem of teachers going away? Should we have a blended system rather than just computers or just teachers? It's very critical for understanding the logic of how we ended up where we are today, which path we came here to. We came through a path where we thought it was all about people. And we started using technology very selectively to solve part of this problem, because what happened was that in medicine, there's something that is very generally applicable to the rest of education, which is, as opposed to aviation, where pilots fixed a very, very large proportion of their safety problem by just starting to work together as a team, the two people in the cockpit, actually not having one captain who bullied through that the plane is not out of fuel, getting it legitimate that the co-pilot can say, I think we're out of fuel. It's a lot more complicated and much more knowledge-intensive disciplines. Aviation is 50 to 100 skills that are applied over and over again, whereas medicine or economics or history or sociology, all the other academic disciplines, are thousands, or in some cases tens of thousands of learning objectives, at least if you break them down to the smallest components, up to 10,000 learning objectives for a 2-semester subject. So it's a very different problem. And we saw that back in these days. We saw that their knowledge models broke under pressure. And we started to get more and more interested in dissecting this problem, trying to figure out, could we change the way we actually store this in their brains in the first place? So while we still respect that the other aspects are super important, even in higher ed, when you take doctors and nurses with 20 years of experience, we see symptoms of something that went wrong early on in their education. There's also something else that is really important, which is these expert performers that we were often looking at. This is an example of it. These expert performers turned out to be very, very different. They performed way better under pressure. We know that top elite sports people, they're really good under pressure, right? Is that our average students? So when we look at this is interesting for several reasons. First of all, because it was a Danish team who beats the crap out of the Brits at the Olympics in London, after the Brits cheated initially and got an extra start on a false basis. But it's also interesting because, for a personal reason, or for us, is that here we go. The guy in the back there, he actually works for me. So and he's about 6 months away from graduating as a medical doctor. While he's been on the Danish Olympic team and held the world record for 10 years, he's gotten 2 kids. His wife is an Olympic rower on the Danish national team, and they're both highly likely to get a medal in Rio. But he's not normal. What sets him apart? He's extremely disciplined about how he plans his time. He's extremely disciplined about what he prioritizes, and he's extremely good at doing what? Focusing on his weak areas. That's actually the complete contrary to what we found when we were starting to dissect why do knowledge models break under pressure. They break under pressure because the weaker students or the average students learned in a very different way. First week, they studied chapter 1. Second week, they went on to chapter 2 and forgot everything about chapter 1. Week 7, nothing had, they pretended that week 1 through 6 never happened. What does somebody like Matt do? That's the name of that guy. What does he do? He's constantly trying to figure out where I need to close some gaps that are stopping me from being efficient every minute of my life. The other part is, he's extremely committed. That's not the average learner we see, particularly not when we move out of the high-profile disciplines like medicine or law. We don't see them behave like this. He's out there in rough weather, it hurts, it's cold, it's shitty, and everybody else bails out. This is actually a day when they were the only ones who went out. That's his normal life. Also at home, also when he studies. Most students are like this. They're lost. They're meandering around. They don't know why they're doing what they're doing. They're just trying to see if they can survive the next 5 minutes like this young wolf. The fundamental thing is, a lot of the students have no clue what is expected of them and how they become better learners. I'll show you some real data. This is an enormous amount of data from some of our systems, where we constantly ask the students how confident they are about their answers. And we do that for a number of reasons. It's one of their strongest input parameters to predicting when they're going to forget stuff, which is an important part of helping students, keeping track of when they're going to forget stuff. But it also gives us some abilities to do derived research on general patterns in learning. And this is one of them. Out of, I think this is 380 million responses from students across many different disciplines. 17% of those answers, the students were unconsciously incompetent. This is a construct we've inherited from human factors research, where the thing we're most worried about when we see professionals make errors, those are the ones who are making them without even knowing that there are things they don't know. That's where patients die, companies go bust. 17% of the interactions with the students were unconsciously incompetent. This is horrible. See if I can move as far away from the loudspeakers as possible. If we just fix that problem alone, we're in a better situation, I think. If we can find a way to make the students more aware of what they don't know, and can we do that? That's interesting. Can I borrow one of your pens? Can I steal? So, when we look at what happens to students over time, we ask them, I know this, and at the other end, I have no clue about what the answer is. And then there are 2 intermediate categories. Over the first semester of asking them this question consistently every day when they're going through this, what happens to this one is that the response time answering this one stays stable, but they become a lot faster on these 3. So we actually have quite firm evidence that we can make them better at knowing what they don't don't know, just over the course of one semester. There are other aspects of this that are interesting. If we look at this, this is how students solve a very simple math problem. They have an equation up here, they have to isolate something down here. This is way more complex than we ever imagined it would be, and they're all correct ways to get there. They're not necessarily efficient ways, but they're all ways where students were able to use real math to get a real correct math answer out of it. So there is no way we can say that the student who took this path out here is an idiot. It's actually a student who used math appropriately. But what is the derived problem if we don't respect this? The problem is something we can observe in a macro perspective when we ask students if they like math. How large a proportion of the world's population likes math? 25%. 75% hates math. 75% of the world's population think they suck at math, and 75% of the world's population profoundly believe that they cannot improve in math. Why? Because when you're in the fringes here, the traditional system has a very hard time accommodating them and leaving enough room to learn slightly different than the middle of it. Most adaptive systems are actually trying to see if we can find one golden solution in the middle and see if we can get students as close to that golden way to get from A to B as possible. I profoundly disagree with this. I think we need to build systems that are accommodating and allow students to learn in different ways. What's interesting about it is, can we prove that we can do that? So this is an example. This is about 1,000 students. The previous graph is the same 1,000 students. So when they first tried to do this, only 34% of the students were able to solve the problem. So the graph before was only about 300 students who actually got from A to B. The remaining 76% of the students who are not capable of getting from A to B. If you just give them a few minutes interacting with a computer that can handle that graph for that spider web of different ways to get from A to B, half of them could learn it in a few minutes. This is after 12 years of math education, that you can actually cut the problem by half. Think about it if you didn't just spend a few minutes, but you actually allowed them to use this for a few weeks or a few months, maybe the last few years of high school. Another very, very important aspect of using this in conjunction with the other things that are going on is this. So these are progression curves from the same students. This is only a subset of the students, to not make it too unwieldy. But here you see students progressing over time to competency on the y-axis. There's something that is really, really important here. Look at these. What are happening with these students? This plateau here is about 8 hours long. That's 8 hours where the student makes almost no progress, or feels like the student is making no progress. But can we say anything about whether progress has been made? Any ideas? Who would say that progress was made? There is actually something we can tell from this, that progress was made. Because look at this. All of these plateaus are followed by an acceleration. So they actually catch up. This is brand new. Nobody's proven this before. These are data that are just a few months old. But it's interesting to see these things because it actually means that if we can get students through those periods of struggling, they will be rewarded by catching up later. But what happens to the students who think they suck at math and they cannot improve in math? They give up when they're in those plateaus. I hope that proves the point of how important it is to help those students who are on the fringes of that enormous graph, because otherwise you lose them when they're on these plateaus. This is an 8th grade student doing a 12th grade curriculum in another language. This is my daughter before we moved to the US last year. This is a student with a severe learning disability, like severe learning disability, completely demolished kid. And we also look at the student with a learning disability, they're proportionally more pronounced, but she still gets through them. So I think in all, these are indications of what you can accomplish if you both use computers for some of the things, these students, they need human teachers as well, because this only deals with part of the problem. I'll come back to that in a second. This was the slide I was missing before. So this is what it looks like this is what an adaptive system could be. It's boring. Our commercial people hate it when I say that. But adaptive systems are fairly boring. The same way as if you just take 1 second out of what comes out of a teacher's mouth through many of your mouths out, it's not ingenious as that 1 minute. But when you put it together, that's where the magic is established. That's also how adaptive systems should be judged. Coming back to this, one of the most important things that we can contribute is to move them from being here to here. And there are many different aspects of it. There is this aspect of even believing that there is a problem and that you can get through it. But there is also just the aspect of being able to look at knowledge and say, do I know this or not? When you're here, you're beyond therapeutic reach. When you're here, you can actually do something about it. Here they're in denial, here they're not. So, what could a blended approach look like? This is a school in Chicago in a poor area. Have you seen classrooms like this before? At least in the US, it's highly unusual. Because the classroom is actually defined by the colors on the carpet. The students are sitting by the wall, and you think, holy cow, this supports all ideas about the pigeon factories, the chicken factories of American education, right? They put students facing the wall. But it's actually very deliberate. This is made by a very, very mindful group of educators and architects. And originally they had the students facing out when they were doing the computer work, but they got distracted. So it actually gives them small private rooms to focus when they're using computers as part of the daily lives in the school. And then they pull the students out in smaller sessions around these islands or in front of these whiteboards. So they haven't decided at the beginning of the day what the individual student is going through, but it's based on that individual student's needs. And then you think, wow, this is great. They must already be using adaptive learning here. No, they're not. They're using basic craftsmanship of good education and how to organize the classroom. So what happened was I gave a keynote for a large group at the University of Chicago interested in urban education. And the architect was actually standing right here, but I cut him out. He came up after the meeting saying, wow, if we took adaptive learning and put on top of what we're doing here, we will get something really powerful out of it. So you don't need adaptive learning to do some of this. You can already bring more value with some of these fundamental ways to reorganize the classroom. But if you do this with adaptive learning, where what happens here along the edges is more qualified, more stimulating, so that you don't lose the weak students when they sit there alone, you lose them on the plateau, you reinforce their feeling that they can't learn something. It's safer to do this, we both agree, both the architect and I. So no matter which approach to learning we can find, I just picked some of the most stereotypical ones. The important thing, so this would be the Kolb's learning pyramid. This is knowledge, skills, and attitudes. This is Bloom's taxonomy. Here I've cheated, it's just another representation of Bloom. But no matter what, there are no single technologies that can deal with all aspects in any of these models. I think anybody who claims that we can make one technology that takes over education is an absolute moron. And the reason why is that that person does not respect how complex and multidimensional education is. So there are, of course, technocrats or technologists who think that singularity is right around the corner. In other words, where computers are so smart that they can teach themselves how to outmaneuver mankind. But I think we need to be roughly at that level. There are also people now claiming that they can get computers to interpret text and semantic relationships and generate content by themselves, including some of the big companies out there. I would say, if you see somebody in education and say they fixed this for education, I would not believe it. Because there is a much more valuable problem out there that is worth 100 or 1,000 times that, that's called Google. If you can do that, Google is becoming many times more valuable if you can suddenly interpret text automatically, and the meaning of text automatically, or something like that. before they can do that, it's not coming to education. So I think it will probably be seen outside education before it's seen in education. Until then, we probably have to accept the responsibility to continue to be teachers and to continue to be learning companies who are curating content and actually trying to help students learn these things, because the fundamental thing is not going to be solved by just a magic computer program written somewhere. And I'll end with a couple of examples on why I think it's important. So it's always great when people use their own kids, right? It's actually known as the thing you should not do. And I've already mentioned one of my daughters, and this is the other one. So I think our graphics recorder asked if I was an anarchist. No, but I do like to break the rules, at least bend them. Anyway, I found this by chance on the school's website, and I actually think that what this indicates is something where I can't describe it with words, but it makes me understand why it's important that there are still teachers involved, because this connection between them is important. I don't think computers can take over that. And then the next thing is you should never describe your neighbors either, right? Don't use your own immediate approximate environment, but by chance he lives really close. What is interesting about this picture is something else. Is what do these other guys do? They help him do this job, right? I think that's what technology can do for teachers. I think technology can be that component in education that allow the teachers to do their job even better. The same way as technology does that in my own profession in medicine. Like, I'm super excited, and I was particularly excited when I went through med school that I didn't have to taste the patient's urine to determine whether they had diabetes or not. I could very, very fast just use a smart dipstick approach and the problem was solved, right? We don't need less doctors just because we got dipsticks or because we got MRIs. We actually need more. So I don't think I've met any group who've seen adaptive technologies of any group of teachers who did not for the first time think, oh, he's talking about taking us out of business. I'm not. I'm talking about qualifying the role of the teacher, talking about protecting the important work of that teacher. And yes, there could be financial people out there who think, we can probably save some money. But I do think it's a very fundamental thing, the same way as in healthcare. We're not going to let our kids get less than the education we can afford, which is probably roughly the level we're paying now. The same way as in healthcare. We're not just going to let a lot of people die when we know we can do better. So I hope that that thing will not be the central problem. But I don't think we can stop it by saying, let's not do it. So fundamentally, I do think that we can make this person, and that person over here worth a lot more by empowering the individual student to get more out of the time they use with computers, but also by focusing the effort so that you don't spread your time over 25 different students, or it's roughly 1 to 25 here. Because there are some students who have a very different need. The need for teacher time is not evenly distributed among the students. It's very unevenly distributed, and it's very, very hard without modern analytics, or we can at least improve it with modern analytics, try to emphasize where you should spend your time as teachers. I'll stop here and leave ample time for questions. And if you don't have any questions, I have so many war stories that we'll run out of time. So when we made a labs platform, virtual labs, several years ago, while you're thinking about questions, we couldn't figure out why we couldn't make it work. So what happened was so it was basically in higher education biology labs, students, one of the things was the students should be able to design their own experiments. We came out of simulation originally and thought this was a slam dunk. The professors in the US that led these teams on deciding what we should try to teach were saying, we want really applied skills. We want something that is at the top of the pyramid. This is what really characterizes what biology is. They need to think like scientists. They need to think conceptually. We don't want all the memorization stuff. It makes total sense. It's at the top of the learning pyramid, right? Like creating new knowledge or strategizing, stuff like that. couldn't make those simulators work. We failed, and we failed, and we failed. I went on the road trying to look at students who use them, and something shocking happened. We could see that the professors were thinking that they were living up here. The students in the colleges in the US, they were here. As fundamentally as, how many of you have heard about diffusion? Remember what it is? This thing that chemical substance diffuses out into the surroundings around it, or the substance around it. You probably also remember that the higher the concentration is, the faster diffusion happens. So we had made this diffusion experiment building thing where it was pretty cool. It could definitely meet these objectives. And if you knew, if you were qualified to do this, wow, what a way to practice your skills. So I had one of the subject matter experts, students, in a small room, just her, me, and him. And she kept failing. She didn't get anywhere. And then at some point I said, do you know what concentration is? She said, yeah, I think so. Okay. So I took a mug of coffee, it was half full, and I dropped one piece of sugar in it. And I said, what is the concentration of sugar now? Assuming that there was no sugar in it before. What is the concentration of sugar? It's actually a trick question because you have to make an abstraction to say one piece of sugar per half a cup of coffee, right? So I didn't expect you to be able to answer that, and she couldn't. Then I said, how can I double it? This one should, if you cannot answer this, I don't think you have a snowball's chance in hell to design your own diffusion experiment shedding light on the impact of concentration. So no idea. And then the professor grabbed the cup of coffee and he said, let me show you how. I said, okay, I think we have the point. We need to be adaptive enough to catch her where she is instead of putting a challenge in front of her. It's not her fault that it breaks her. For some reason, she doesn't know what concentration is. And we need to help her before we throw her into a horrible environment where they keep failing. So we fixed this, and then I went on the road 2 months later. We basically made sure that all of these foundation concepts were there, and we remediated them adaptively. It actually led to a whole new generation of adaptive technologies, the ones that can teach by themselves, not only the ones that can be used in conjunction with other things like SmartGroup and LearnSmart, where our two big product platforms, but a new generation called Achieve and Master that can basically add a lot of extra content to close much bigger gaps. But I went on the road about 2 or 3 months later, again, testing at another school with a student who were now capable of getting through it. And then she said at the end of this adaptive part of it, she says, this reminds me an awful lot about LearnSmart. And she didn't notice that the small red logo was the same, and like the trademarks looked the same, stuff like that. One was called LearnSmart, the other one was called LabSmart back then, which I, by the way, do not like. Okay, tell me more. Then she says, the problem is that I'm a single mom, I'm a paramedic, I'm taking a master's degree, I have 2 kids, I don't have time to study every day, and LearnSmart makes me study every day. So I said, okay, I didn't say anything, I just let her keep talking. And then she continued, because if I learn in LearnSmart, if I don't study today, I have to study more tomorrow. It's like, no shit, Charlotte. This was a surprise to her that it worked that way. So even somebody as responsible as that, I'm sure she was a great paramedic. But even somebody at her level of education, it was a surprise that she needed to spread out the education and the pressure on her. It's actually one of the biggest challenges for these students. Probably one of the things that leads to the biggest deficiencies in performance later when they're not able to distribute this. So one of the things we did was we completely turned everything upside down and said, maybe the biggest impact we could have is to help them do this distribution of workload. Because, of course, well, the fact that she didn't pick up that the 2 products were related was maybe not that smart. But on the other hand, she was truly a good student. What if we were able, for that really large mass of students to help them distribute this. So if you said this thing I talked about where week 1 you do this, week 2 you do this, week 3 you do this, and week 4 you do something. But instead of just moving on and then right before the finals you come back and you start revisiting stuff, you selectively find out, different from individual to individual, what you should re-practice. So, or we call it recharge. What is interesting, if you can do that, you can actually fundamentally change that time economy for that student, because by a very select effort, week to week, by adding a little bit of recharge every week, you can have a huge impact on what that repetition debt they have right before the finals is. That changes a lot. That's one of the few areas where computers can really beat even the best teacher in the world. Because even if you only have one student, it's very, very hard to keep track of exactly what did the student struggling with 8 weeks before now, or 8 weeks ago. And what if you have 25? It's impossible, right? And even things like, what if that student's parents were fighting that week, or were about to get a divorce, or somebody died, or whatever happened? You don't even know that when they're not with you. But if you can track how things are going at a very detailed level, we can actually help with some of that accounting. And again, this is not because it should substitute anything the teacher does. It's something where if you can get that ERP system for learning in place, so you actually get your data under control, you can completely change the way you target your human efforts. Any questions so far?
It's not a question actually about the contribution to what we have been telling, but I mean the main issue is, as you mentioned, people are asking if technology, if the hardware or software will be replacing the teachers or not, or the instruction or not. And as publishers, there are lots of questions coming to us and saying that if textbooks will exist or not. And if we are talking about adaptive learning, if you ask me the question, what's the core of adaptive learning? I would say that if you are speaking about different learning types, different learning styles, and all these students who are unique, who have unique learning preferences, what they need is content. And if you ask me the question, if they need more content or not, to have adaptive learning, they need much more content than they used to have. So the importance of textbooks, maybe the name is changing, it's not textbook anymore, but the content, but it is now more and more important than before.
Yes. We know that because we measure that constantly. So in the existing paradigm, there was a linear flow of knowledge going through a textbook, right? Typically there was only one way to explain something. Then the teacher added more ways to explain something, or you could have a workbook where you have to put things together in your own head. What we see now is that there is an enormous impact if you have redundancy. So often we make 5, 7 different ways to explain something, several different modalities. Let me, by the way, shoot a cruise missile through one of the biggest misconceptions out there. We can prove it with billions and billions of data points behind it. There is no such things as just 3 different learning styles. There is probably 3 trillion different learning styles because they change from minute to minute for the individual student. There's no way where you can say that a certain student has a preference for videos over text. It's BS, pardon my French. There is absolutely zero support. We can prove it's not the case. What really matters is the quality differences between the individual components. So the difference on 3 different ways to explain something on video is much more important and impactful to think about when you're producing them than to say, let's just make a truckload of videos, because some students like that. Much more important to concentrate on what you do inside those different modalities. And in that, actually, sometimes it's fine to have 4 different ways to explain something in the same modality, which is what we do because we constantly measure, okay, this is a particularly hard thing for students to learn. So let's add some different ways to do this. Then, of course, yes, we use population statistics to pick the first one. So we will use 2 things to decide what to use first, because it's constantly a question of what do you do next? The same way as for a teacher. Adaptive learning is, in essence, just a matter of figuring out what do we do next. And when we make that decision, and you say, okay, in my toolbox here, I've identified a need. have I identified that well enough or not? I'll talk a little bit more about it tomorrow if anybody still has interest. But I'll say maybe I need to ask a few more questions to diagnose the needs better. Or let me say, now I know what the need is. I have a learning resource that takes 90 seconds, and I have a learning resource that on average takes 15 seconds. They both have different population statistics behind them in terms of how likely are they to have a positive impact on the student. Typically, the longer one has a better impact, but it also costs more in seconds, right? So you balance them up against each other, and sometimes you try with one and sometimes with the other. The same way as with Google, we use a ton of different things to make that decision, like hundreds of parameters that are all weighed up against each other when we pull one or the other out of the bag. But it's those two core parameters that are important. Then when you run out of resources, you say the student still not learned it, it's probably a good idea to either flag it to the teacher, first to the teacher. I'm done as a computer, I give up here. That's the first thing. But the second thing is, make sure that it goes back to the team who made this product in the first place, that you ran out of explanations here. There are still students struggling here. And you probably don't have to be Albert Einstein to see we pick the ones that have the biggest impact first. So we've changed the way we invest in it. So we invest where we can see 2,000 students need this. Let's go there now before we go after the stuff we've seen once. So we constantly go after where we have the biggest bang for the buck instead of trying to predict what students don't know. And just for the publishers in the room, one of the most catastrophic things we did was initially we thought, we were actually so arrogant, we thought that we could predict what the students would not understand. And we proved that with a very extreme degree of certainty that we were wrong. Because we asked them, whenever they were teaching something or asking a question, to write remediation materials for common misconceptions. In other words, they should try to predict the common misconceptions. Like, when you're writing a distractor, you probably think you have a common misconception behind it, or even if it's more sophisticated probe items. So then we did a statistic on it about half a year later. And out of 100 remediation comments that were written, or remediation pieces that were written, only 10% were used. Out of 100 that were needed, only 10% were written, which meant that we roughly had about a 1% precision in predicting what the students needed. In most businesses, you go bust if you have a 1% precision in predicting the customer needs. So we stopped doing that overnight. Basically prohibited anybody to pretend they could predict what the students did not understand, or were not going to understand. And instead, measure it and respond to that. I'll stop here 2 minutes early. Any last minute questions?
Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. Well, I got the impression, and let me know if I'm wrong. So, adaptive learning is mostly like individual thing. So we can understand the weak points of the student and try our best to help him work there. But can it work in a classroom of, let's say, 20 students, 25 students in the class, and only one teacher available?
Yes. And it's actually a really good point, because you have to start with the student. But then when you add the teacher to the mix, what happens here is these students, they work on their individual paths. But then you just need relatively simple analytics and reporting to filter out, okay, here are some common traits. So let's pull out 3 students and change what you do as a teacher to those students. So what they physically would do here is they would take this one, and this one, pull over here and let's talk about proportions, because they're all struggling with proportions. Then when they've got proportions, 5 minutes later, back to their computers and you pull out somebody else. And then if there is a larger thing where the majority of the students have an issue with it, you leave 3 over here, and then you bring the majority over here and say, it looks like we all need to talk about GDP. One more time, let's try it again. Then you send them back, and then you get a closed loop on whether they got it. So you can target your efforts as a teacher, because you just get more informed about what the students' needs are. It doesn't tell you how to teach it, it just tells you what is actually on the inside of their brain right now, so where can you probably spend your time best. I think that's the best way to change the teaching environment. There are situations where you could have them work in groups around adaptive products, but with much less experience with it, and it's actually more in the problem-solving environments. So let's say that you take these lab environments, for instance, and allow them to collaborate on building an experiment. But then what you're getting out of it is something else than what we traditionally after, because then you start to be the collaboration between them. We lose some of that resolution or insight into who are actually doing what. So it's a lot more chaotic what happens there. But I would not advise against it. I would just not use it now as an individual monitoring of where they are. Then you have to be much more active as a teacher. Did that answer?
What is the average class time? This one.
You probably need a mic.
Let's have this final question.
Yeah. What's the average class time and where the points that the exchange that the student, well, whether it's one-to-one or one-to-one, was it where the questions open-ended, like when the teacher is the teacher guiding the students to a certain area of knowledge, or he's just building from the students' experiences?
So we have
In the beginning.
Yeah. So we've done this on a very wide variety of different courses, and with different ways of implementing it. It can either be used where you do everything else that you're normally doing and then adding this on top of it as a homework aid, or the most powerful or the most impactful one is the one where you assign it ahead of time so that the students show up prepared in an adaptive system, and then you guide your teaching. That's also known as a flipped classroom. Yeah, so it's a way to fuel a flipped classroom so that you actually just be better prepared than you would otherwise be when you start a flipped classroom session.
And it's a 60-minute session.
You can do anything. It doesn't matter. What's interesting about this is if an adaptive system is good enough, it doesn't need to know what happened in the past. It should always be able to bring value very, very fast. But of course it gets better if it knows something, but it doesn't need to know a lot.
And it works on minimum data.
Yes.
How to relieve the stress? For example, when you adopt such a learning environment as a teacher, you see a group who's struggling to solve a problem, and all of a sudden, this group would like to give up on the problem, and you do not want to intervene during the time where you think that if you give them enough time, they will reach the answer or the solution. How to relieve the stress? Because the entire class will feel that they are working or they are learning in a stressful environment in this case. How to deal with such a
So what you're mentioning is one of these classic things where it's very hard to tell a computer.
Yeah, it's a stressful moment for the student to feel that they cannot have any progress on the problem in hand. How to make sure, how to show the students such a care that, okay, there is that excellent, how to convince them.
So
in semesters, we have a limited time for the subject.
So let's say that most of the curricula we looked at are between 5% and maximum 15% conceptual, hard, emotional learning objectives. A large bulk of it is technical, hardcore math stuff or geology stuff or something. If you said, I know that with the adaptive systems, we can get the students through that struggling on the basic stuff when they're working alone, leaving you, who understands emotions, because computers are not really good at that, you, with a better insight into spotting the patterns where you should respond, embracing them on the rest of them, because where they will have the stress that are actually probably more dangerous would be in the group environments, where 1 out of 4 is not really engaging. So it's actually just one of them who's solving the problem. It's impossible to get a computer to contribute anything valuable to that now. But if I can spend all of your time there, I actually think you can save David or Mike or whoever it is who are right now hiding, because you as a teacher might be spread too thinly. Because the other ones, on the other hand, you don't have to worry as much about it, because they do not get demotivated or stressed out during those plateaus, because as you can see, we get them through it, and actually really fast is self-perpetuating in a positive way, because once they have experienced some of the accelerations, that's a huge reward. We don't use badges, we don't use rewards, we don't use these cheap things that don't mean anything 2 months or 2 minutes after you got it. What really matters is then you get that feeling of success, like, wow, I just completed 45 learning objectives. They don't know it's 45 learning objectives, but they feel an acceleration.
Thank you for this amazing session. Can I just ask you, because we'll be back tomorrow night at 7 p.m. to do another session. You very briefly just tell us what you talk about.
Yeah. So tomorrow will be an in-depth, much more in-depth discussion about how does the science behind this work, what science have we found, and how do these products work. So it's a way to translate what we found into products. Thank you.
Thank you.